the Public Library, and we're hosting this event in collaboration with the Winchester Historical Society. We're pleased to have Karen Weintraub and Michael Kuchta, co-authors of the new book, Born in Cambridge, 400 Years of Ideas and Inventions. Karen is a journalist now working as a health reporter at USA Today. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Scientific American, and Staff, and she is the co-author of The Autism Revolution and Vast Minds. Michael is an architect and campus planner. They have lived in Cambridge for more than 20 years. Welcome, Karen and Michael. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Weintraub, and I'm in the yes. And this is Karen Weintraub. Why did we write this book? I think we're asking ourselves that question. Basically, we have lived in Cambridge for more than 20 years, and we kept seeing all of these historical plaques around town that seemed to be interesting, and then occasionally we would read articles in national publications, the New York Times, about some interesting thing that had happened in this place that we had moved to. So we started making a list of firsts, of, the first college in North America, or the first printing press, the first sewing machine, the first highlighter marker, and started a list and put together a book proposal, which MIT Press was crazy enough to agree to publish. And so that was in 2015, so it took us about 7 years to get the book to the point where it's an actual book. But it was, neither of us was not our day job. And so we had to do this on nights and weekends, and raising our children and torturing our children with history. But so we basically tried to focus on. Let's see if this will work. Let's see if I can connect this. Sorry, there we go. So we, having made this list of all of these things that we found out had originated in our fair state of Cambridge, we settled on a series of topics or themes. I'm not going to read this entire list, but so we weren't just going to talk about science and technology, although there's a lot of science and technology that happens there. But there are a lot of innovations that are related to Cambridge's industrial past. Of course, there are a lot of authors and literary figures who have lived or worked there. There's a really interesting story about the role that people in Cambridge played during World War II with the invention of radar and some of the other technologies that were instrumental in World War II. And then today, it's, of course, the Center for Biotechnology and Pharmaceutical Research, and has had a long history of innovation in the computer field. So we sort of cobbled together 46 or so different stories, and our goal was essentially to try to tell interesting stories about, in some cases, things you may have heard of, but in other cases, things that were new, or at least new to us. So let me advance. It worked. Oh, it did work. So what we did is read a lot of books, first of all. This is our sort of research library for the project. But then Karen, being a journalist, she likes to interview people because that's a way, in part, to learn new things about old things, or to get fresh perspectives on some of these topics, in some cases hundreds of years old. And then, because I'm an architect and I think visually, we wanted this to be a visually rich book, so there are somewhere around 200 different images in the book, which took a long time to assemble, getting rights to 3 different examples from the book. One, Anne Bradstreet, an early poet, Benjamin Waterhouse, who was one of the first physicians and professors at Harvard Medical School, and then lastly talk about someone from Winchester, a man named Claude Shannon, who I don't know if you've heard of, but was profoundly important in the creation of the digital age. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Karen.
So Anne Bradstreet was a poet. Well, first she grew up in England, and at age 17, her father, who was a leading Puritan at the time, an idealist, he thought that in England they were not properly respecting God. There was too much pomp and circumstance, and he thought we needed a new world, a new way to invent the way things were in order to follow God's word. And so he was this idealist, and he dragged his 5 children, including Anne, to this new country. They landed here in 1630, so quite early in the time. And he was, Thomas Dudley was the father, and he was the first settler, I took out a picture of the plaque, but he was the first settler of what was then Newtown and became Cambridge shortly thereafter. Anne moved there with him. She was 19 at the time, married. You would think, or now when we look back, we think, oh, how exciting. There was this new world that they were discovering. And there's a quote from her on a gate at Harvard, which might be the next picture actually. I came into this country where I found a new world and new manners at which my heart rose. And so it was supposed, oh, my heart rose, right? Except in those days that meant she felt like she needed to vomit. It was such a terrifying environment. And sorry, go back now to that last picture. Sorry, that's the gate at Harvard. I can do it with the clicker. This is more or less, this is 100 years later, but this is more or less what Cambridge looked like at the time. Like I said, Anne was one of the first settlers. The river, the Charles River, was tidal and mostly swamp at the end. We think of it as having a hard edge, but it was really a swamp at the time. So marsh is a nicer word, I guess. And so she would have had to lead a pretty difficult life, making her own food and her own clothing, chasing cows through the thickets, and that sort of thing. So it was quite a difficult life. And at 19, newly arrived, she got sick, and it was the second time that she almost died from a sickness and survived. And to thank God, because she was a very devout person, she decided to write a poem about it. And in those days, women didn't have a lot of public outlets. She couldn't be a preacher or sermon. So writing poetry was really the only way to be expressive. And the poem, she wrote her first poem in Cambridge. It's the first eventually published poem in British North America in the new colonies. So, and I'll read a little bit of it. So, twice 10 years old, not fully told, so she's 19. Since nature gave me breath, my race is run, my thread is spun. Is here, lo here is fatal death. All men must die, and so must I. This cannot be revoked. For Adam's sake, this word God spake, when he so high provoked. Yet live I shall, this life's but small, in place of highest bliss, where I shall have all I can crave, no life is like to this. So she rhymed, and her poetry was lost for hundreds of years. Basically, people thought that it was trite and simplistic. And then Adrian Rich, a poet who later lived in Cambridge, was involved in helping to resuscitate her image and said really that she was, because of her plain spoken language and because she focused on topics of daily life, survival of an illness rather than Greek tragedies, which was much more common at the time, that she really presaged a lot of the American poets like Robert Frost and others we know about today. And so her reputation was resurrected hundreds of years later. And the Puritans, I mean, we like starting with the story A because it's the moment Cambridge was founded essentially, but also because I think that the Puritan culture helped shape Cambridge and Massachusetts. So Cambridge was supposed to be the original capital of Massachusetts, but it turned out Boston was a better place for that, better logistically, access to the sea. And so they moved the capital to Boston, and as a consolation prize, they gave a university college to Cambridge. And so that's why Harvard, which was founded in 1636, so for a few years after Anne left, was based there. And the idea is this simplicity and this focus on people having relationships with God not mediated through the Pope seem to really, and education really seems to shape a lot of what has happened in Massachusetts since then. And that was something that struck us again and again in writing this book, how the history of Cambridge is kind of a microcosm of the whole United States. And that fascinated us. Yeah. So we don't know what she looked like. This is a fictitious, somebody's imagination. And Charlotte Gordon, who wrote a wonderful biography of her called Mistress Bradstreet, said that she's pictured as this bonnet-wearing Puritan, but in fact she was a radical because of her poetry. And so the book was called The 10th Buttes Lately Sprung Up in America, or Several Poems Compiled with Great Variety of Wit. It was published in 1850 by her brother-in-law. 1650, thank you, by her brother-in-law. And she did want it to be published. She didn't put her name on it. You can see near the bottom of the by a gentle woman in these parts. That was the modest way of presenting herself. These were her poems. Okay. So now I'm going to jump forward 150 years or so to Benjamin Waterhouse. That I think is a closer approximation of what he actually looked like. And on July 8th, 1799, Benjamin Waterhouse, who was a doctor, cut a scar into his 5-year-old son's arm and dragged a piece of thread through it. The thread had been contaminated with smallpox. And this was a technique that had been invented really a year or two earlier by Edward Jenner in the UK. And Jenner had realized that the milkmaids would catch this disease called cowpox and were protected against smallpox, and cowpox was much less serious. Unfortunately, we're now sort of familiar with that with monkeypox, where it's, you get these hideous, horrible boils, but it's not as lethal. Smallpox in those days killed about 1/3 of the people who were infected. And so that is why we call it vaccination, because the word for cow in French is vache, and so that's where the word vaccination comes from. Anyway, so Waterhouse dragged this piece of thread through his son's arm, did the same for a 12-year-old servant boy who lived with them. When they got these poxes, he took some gunk from the pus from the boxes and did the same thing to his other children and nursemaid. And they all had the poxes, but they weren't that sick, except the 12-year-old boy who went outside in very hot weather and did a lot of work. And he was a little tired, but they sent him a few weeks later to a smallpox, I guess we would call it like a sanitarium, where they would intentionally infect people in hopes of, was like chickenpox parties, where they would intentionally infect people hoping that they would have a milder disease, and the boy didn't catch smallpox. And so he was the first one in America proven to be protected against smallpox. And it was still quite a difficult procedure at the time. Another doctor in Marblehead tried the same thing and ended up killing 68 people because he infected them with smallpox. He got them sick with smallpox instead of cowpox. So it was really quite a feat that Waterhouse had succeeded in doing this. He communicated at the time with Thomas Jefferson, who was then the president, and shared his technology. Jefferson helped promote this technology in the colonies, and people followed Waterhouse's instructions for how to do this. He was kind of a difficult man, Waterhouse. He was probably the best educated doctor in America. He was born Quaker in Rhode Island and was abroad, took possibly the last ship that left the colonies for England before the Revolutionary War. And so he was not here during the Revolution, and a lot of his contemporaries resented that. He also might have kind of been a little full of himself. His biographer described him as having assumed an attitude of insufferable superiority. So, so he was not the most popular. And then Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the writer and father of the Supreme Court Justice, described him as the good people of Cambridge listened to his learned talk when they were well and sent for one of the other 2 doctors when they were sick. So he ended his life sort of getting kicked out of Harvard. He had been one of the first faculty members of Harvard Medical School. But his friendship with Adams, John Adams, who he had met at Benjamin Franklin's dinner table in Europe as a young man, ended up helping him continue to work. But so he had a really interesting life. And interestingly to us also, the thread or the thought of vaccination is still important in Cambridge today. Well, that's his house. If you've been on Cambridge Common, the far side from Harvard's here, Harvard Square is here. The far side is Waterhouse Street, named for Benjamin Waterhouse, and that's his house. It's still there, owned by a famous architect now. So, as I was starting to say, what? Yeah. So, you may have heard of Moderna in the last 2 years. Moderna is based in Cambridge, was founded in Cambridge. 4 men founded it, a Harvard professor named Derek Rossi, an MIT professor named Rob Langer, Nubar Fayan, who is with Flagship Pioneering and Investment, venture capitalist, and Dr. Kenneth Chen, a Harvard stem cell researcher and cardiovascular doctor. So they had ideas. They were working with this mRNA idea for a number of years. The company was founded actually in 2010. They were working with the federal government. They had just started a pilot project when COVID hit, and they said, well, why don't we reconfigure this pilot project? I forget if it was for flu or something else, and redirect it against SARS-CoV-2, and the rest, as they say, is history. The company now, that's their current headquarters in Technology Square. They're about to move to a new building being built for them. They went from, I think, 800 employees before the pandemic to 3,500 at the moment. And they've already outgrown this, was it like 460,000 square foot building that they're building, and they've already outgrown. So it's quite a success story, and it's kind of interesting to us. Again, it's bracketed this history from 1800 and then now the contemporary history, contemporary events. So now to the Winchester, not native, but connection, yes.
All right. So this is a photograph of Claude Shannon from the days in which he was teaching at MIT. And he, for a time, I guess, next slide, in the 1950s, lived in this house, which is at 5 Cambridge Street in Winchester. It's a house from I believe, the 1850s or 19th century, and has been occupied by a number of people. It's a historic home, and he moved here when he took his full-time position as a MIT faculty member in the 1950s, and lived there until, I think, a few years before his death around 2001. So Claude Shannon, if you have never heard of him, and we had never heard of him before we started this research, and so one of the things that was sort of really fascinating to us was just discovering new things that added to our sort of understanding of the world we live in. So Claude Shannon is recognized as the father of the information age. So that's a pretty weighty title, right? And what he essentially did, and why we claim him as having made a contribution in Cambridge, given that he lived in Manchester, was that as a master's student at MIT in the 1930s, he wrote his master's thesis on something called Boolean algebra. So Boolean algebra is something developed by an English mathematician named George Boole in the 19th century, which tries to make math out of logic. So every statement can be represented as either true or false, and a true statement is a 1, and a false statement is a 0. And this Boolean algebra was a powerful kind of tool for representing kind of logic. And Claude Shannon studied this as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and where he was a math and electrical engineering major. And so when he came to MIT, his job, in addition to studying, was to manage a machine called the differential analyzer. So this was an early mechanical calculating device that filled a room with various gears and rods and pieces of mechanical equipment that were used to, for instance, determine the area under a curve, to do kind of basic calculus. But these mechanical devices had to be essentially reprogrammed for every mathematical equation that you were trying to solve for. And what Claude Shannon realized was that some of the work that was being done through these mechanical means could be done through electrical means. So basically, if you think about a light switch, no one had thought about a light switch as being a carrier of information. But if you have 100 light switches, you start to have what are called binary digits. So Claude Shannon invented the term bit or binary digit, which we now, like your laptop or your smartphone has, 16 gigabytes. A byte is 1,024 bits. So Claude Shannon was the first guy who basically established that there was this relationship between electrical circuitry and logic, and that you could do things like, next slide, in his master's thesis, he designed a circuit diagram for an electric combination lock. So this was basically a device where you would have to press the right numerical sequence to unlock this device. And so it represented, again, using electrical circuitry to have intelligence, to have decision-making capabilities. And this was a sort of pretty novel idea. Most information was transmitted through what we'd say are analog means, so like a telephone or a radio. You would basically have a sine wave which you modulate either by its amplitude or some other way, and that's sort of an analog signal. And again, that's sort of through a radio how you communicate. And he realized that things could be transmitted by breaking them down into these digital bits. And that was a pretty profound way of thinking. He ended up leaving MIT in 1940, and he went to Bell Labs in New York City, which was the research arm of AT&T, the big telephone monopoly. And there, during World War II, he worked on the development of cryptographic systems. So one of the challenges they faced was President Franklin Roosevelt in Washington wanted to be able to communicate with Winston Churchill in London, and there was an undersea cable that connected Washington to London, but they wanted to be able to make the communication secure. So Claude Shannon worked on ways to encrypt the data by actually, they had a very crude way of encrypting voice data, which had like a six note range. So that it was a very, very crude way of converting the voice into a digital form to be transmitted through this undersea cable. And he made a number of other contributions during World War II to the war effort. One of the things he did also while he was at Bell Labs is he was a very playful guy, and he liked to make toys. So this is a toy, it's called Theseus, after the ancient Cretan who had to make his way through the labyrinth and avoid the Minotaur, if you know that sort of story. So this is a toy that basically is a mouse, that could move, and there were magnets underneath that would actually move it. And the goal of the mouse is to find the cheese, which is up there. And this maze is reconfigurable, so each of these little metal panels can be moved. And with a very, very sort of series of switches, basically 100 little light switches, if you think of it that way, he was able to program this so that the mouse would essentially run into a wall and realize, oh no, that's not the way, and remember it by recording that decision in one of these switches, and then go the other way. And eventually, it would find its way to the cheese, and the circuitry would remember that route. So it was essentially an early example of what we today call machine learning, where the computer basically learns your patterns. And this was, again, in 1950. There were barely even computers in those days, and he was so far ahead of sort of the technology. But you would never guess, just looking at this toy, that that was an advanced piece of technology. They actually have this very maze in the MIT Museum in Cambridge, which just had its grand reopening a week and a half ago or so. So if you're really interested in this topic, go visit the MIT Museum. So Claude Shannon, next slide. Oh, is that it? Oh, so Claude Shannon, after working at Bell Labs, he moved back to Cambridge to teach at MIT beginning in 1958, and moved here to Winchester. And he had sort of, I guess the impression is that he had done most of his important work by then in his career. Like, he didn't invent any other mind-blowing concept, I think, after that point. But he was still a valued sort of member of the MIT faculty, and I think his wife Betty, who was a mathematician in her own right, would often help him write his papers. He didn't publish as prolifically as many people in academia do, but by that point he was already an incredible legend. In really, his idea was in a paper that he wrote in 1948, was that any form of information could be represented in digital form. So whether that was a love letter, or an audio recording, or a photograph, he was really the first guy to say, oh, that cell phone that does all that stuff now. Like, he was the first guy to imagine that that was even a possibility. And so we're just really amazed at the impact that he's had on the world that we inhabit today. And
So we can talk endlessly about this, but we'd love to hear what you guys are interested in, and if you have any questions for us.
yeah, we have a little table here with a kind of show and tell items that have been either invented or manufactured in Cambridge, and are happy to talk about any of those as well. But do you have specific questions? Yes.
I have a question about woven hose.
Okay.
So, in the factory, was that significant?
Yeah. So it was.
Yeah. So we tried.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was a fire hose where they put rubber around a knitted, a woven hose. And they used to use the bucket brigades. And so this was able to replace that. Previously, nothing else could hold water without leaking too much. So it was innovative in that sense, but it wasn't the only one doing it. So we actually didn't mention it in the book. Somebody said they invented the tire, but it's not true. But that kind of technology was important, certainly at the time, and innovative.
Yeah, one of the challenges we faced in writing this book is it had to be readable and not more than 300 pages or something.
My door stopped.
And so we went through this vetting process where we would read about something and have to decide whether to include it in our book. There are dozens or maybe even hundreds of people with Nobel Prizes who have lived or worked in Cambridge at some point. We knew that we couldn't write about all of them. So we really looked for things, that seem to have some relation to kind of the world we inhabit today. I mean, maybe you don't eat Junior Mints, but you can still buy them.
I use the verb highlight if you don't
Right.
actually use it.
So we wrote about the electronic spreadsheet, which was invented by first a company called VisiCalc, and then a company called Lotus, which both were based in Cambridge. But we didn't write about, for instance, the principle of nuclear magnetic resonance, which is a fundamental technology. If you've ever had an MRI scan, that the principle of magnetic resonance was first demonstrated in a Harvard lab in the 1940s. But we didn't end up writing about that because the MRI scanner, which people are familiar with today, was not invented really until the 1970s. So we had this sort of weird set of priorities of how to decide what to write about. But at the end of the day, we also wanted to just tell interesting stories. You know, in some cases, these are familiar topics. In lots of cases, they're not. But at the end of the day, we kind of had a vetting process where we sort of wrote drafts of things and just decided we weren't able to tell the best story, and so we didn't write about it.
So we didn't, for instance, write about Facebook. People know that Facebook was founded in a dorm room at Harvard, but we felt like that story had been told. And also, the story is not complete on Facebook yet. And so we didn't want to wade into, we didn't feel like we could contribute to that story, so we didn't do that. The Curious George books, if you're familiar with them, the authors of that spent the last decades of their life in Cambridge, but after the books came out, after they were originated. So we didn't write about them because of that. We fudged with a few things, but that was basically our standard. Did this happen? Did something formative or crucial happen in Cambridge in their life? So we take the word born in Cambridge a little more metaphorically than literal. But it's been a fun adventure to figure this out.
And at the end, we sort of tried to ask ourselves, you know, what's the secret sauce? You know, why is it that all of these things have happened in this place? And to some degree, you know, one of the answers is obviously Harvard and MIT attract some of the, you know, brightest, most entrepreneurial people from across the world, and, you know, oftentimes spawn companies, and, you know, that has an enormous impact on the regional economy, on, you know, the entire Massachusetts economy. But in some cases, it's not related to the academic world. So we highlight the invention of the fig Newton, for instance, which was invented at the Kennedy Bakery in Cambridgeport in the 1890s, and had, you know, it was a factory that made biscuits, and they came up with this cookie called, which they eventually called the Newton. But the idea was it was made from a funnel that was set inside another funnel. So you put the filling inside the inner funnel, and you put the pastry shell in the outer funnel, and you would extrude them, and then they'd go into the oven. And so it was sort of a technological innovation, this, you know, sort of silly, what we think of as a, you know, sort of silly cookie. And they decided on fig paste because that worked the best with their sort of industrial process. And so the head of the company decided to name the cookie after the town of Newton. And eventually they merged with another couple of bakeries to become the National Biscuit Company, otherwise known as Nabisco. And they, you know, the rest is history, as they say. That for a while, the Newton, it was just called the Newton, and then they called it the Fig Newton, and now they're back to just calling it the Newtons because I guess figs aren't a popular fruit anymore. I don't know. So again, we found a lot of reasons to look at the industrial past of the town. So one of the other things that I'm fascinated by is the fact that the very first long-distance telephone call occurred between Boston and Cambridge. So Alexander Graham Bell, who you've all heard of as the inventor of the telephone, he ran his sort of laboratory in Boston, and it turned out there was a company that made home heating systems called the Walworth Company that had its headquarters in Boston and had a factory in Cambridge, and they had a telegraph line that ran from one side of the river to the other. And so when Alexander Graham Bell invented, you know, the telephone and you know, the famous saying, you know, Watson, come here, I want to talk to you, Watson was just in the next room. So, you know, if you have a device that can communicate from one room to another, today we call that a baby monitor. You know, an important invention, but maybe not like changing the world. So to prove the efficacy of his telephone, he had to prove that it worked over a significant distance. And so the way to do that was to use an existing telegraph line from this Walworth company. So Thomas Watson was sent over to the Cambridge manufacturing plant, and you know, they each took notes on what they said and what they heard, and they compared their notes at the end of the experiment, and lo and behold, it worked. And in October of 1876, Alexander Graham Bell received a patent for the telephone, and there was a long dispute with Thomas Edison and Elisha Gray, other sort of inventors who had laid claim to the same technology, but thanks to good intellectual property lawyers, really Alexander Graham won out. And his father-in-law was a lawyer, and his father-in-law said, well, when you're doing your experiments, write down the date that you did them, the time that you did them, and make sure you document your experiment very well. Because when there's a patent dispute, you're going to need to demonstrate the primacy of your invention, the fact that you invented it before anyone else. And so having a father-in-law who was a very smart lawyer who lived in Cambridge was actually fundamental to Bell's success as an inventor. So again, I think we're sort of endlessly fascinated by some of these inventions and innovative people, and could talk about them endlessly, but won't.
Questions? Anybody else?
What sort of people did you find yourself interviewing? Just presuming that a lot of these people are not with us any longer. But.
Yeah.
So we looked for people like Charlotte Gordon, I mentioned Anne Bradstreet. Charlotte Gordon had written a book about her, so we interviewed Charlotte Gordon. We interviewed some scientists about previous discoveries or discoveries they were involved with. The earlier slide of next to the books. This gentleman is Matt Nesselson. He was a very prominent biologist before he came to Harvard. You've heard of Watson and Crick and Franklin, with the shape of DNA, thank you. But they were theoretical, it was a theoretical thing. They thought that's what it was. Well, Matt Nesselson with another gentleman proved that in fact that was the proper shape. And so their experiment is considered one of the seminal experiments of the 20th century. And he also discovered restriction enzymes and early messenger RNA. So we've heard about that in the context of Moderna vaccines. Well, he was very early in that process as well. So he came to Cambridge to Harvard, where he's been since
1960-something.
Yeah, very early 60s. And basically has saved all of us from biological and chemical warfare ever since. So in an early summer that he spent working for the Defense Department, somebody was showing him around and said, look, and this is where we do all of our biological warfare experiments. And they're really cheap. We don't have to spend a lot of money on them. And Messelson's kind of scratching his head thinking, is that a good idea? And he gets back to the office and says, wait, we can kill lots of people really inexpensively and it's not that hard to do. That's probably not the best idea, not a great technology to develop. He had a friend from who he used to eat lunch with at one of the dining rooms at Harvard named Henry Kissinger. And they bumped into each other at an airport one day, and Kissinger says to him, yeah, you know, write me up something about that thing of yours about biological warfare. And he also, Messelson had also given Kissinger, who then gave it to Nixon, Andromeda Strain, right?
Yeah.
The book, the very popular book about a biological thing unleashed on the earth and the terror it could cause. And the combination of the science that Messelson provided and the fear that he provided with Andromeda Strain convinced Nixon to sign this global treaty that is still in place today. It was signed in 71, I think.
74.
74, okay. He's better with kids. And it's still in place today. It has been violated, but only rarely. Syria, we've heard about the times when it's been violated since then. So talking to him in person was pretty thrilling. And he's a lovely guy with an impeccable memory. So it was really fun talking to him.
And like, for instance, we wrote about Julia Child, who lived in Cambridge and was sort of famous as the television personality of the French chef. and on public television in Boston. And we were like, well, who could we talk to about a public television cooking specialist? So we talked to Christopher Kimball, who started America's Test Kitchen and now has a program called Milk Street Cafe and on public television. And so he's sort of the current day version of Julia Child. And he agreed to talk to us. We went to his office in Boston. He lives in Cambridge. But he talked to us about the time when he was invited over to Julia Child's house. And he was, in awe of her ability and clearly was, charting his own path of his own in the business, I guess. And he went to her house and she said, here's a bucket of oysters, shuck these. And he didn't know how to shuck oysters. That was not one of his skills. And he felt like he was humiliating himself in front of his icon, Julia Child. And, he eventually sort of gave up in frustration and had another glass of wine and, left the oysters alone. And he thought, oh, I'll never get invited back. But he, in fact, did get invited back to another dinner where he was able to prove his skills. And so, to tell a story about someone whose Julia Child's no longer alive, but lived in Cambridge for, many decades, and to, hear kind of a personal anecdote from Chris Kimball was just part of our discovery process. That was really fun.
Another question?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share with us what inspired you to work on this passion project, and then also touch about how the pandemic may have affected your research and how this book came to fruition.
Sure. So I guess we started by making by just walking around Cambridge. So let me see if I can.
What he's trying to put up, we took, Mike took some video the other day of some of the signs that are around Cambridge. This happened here, this happened here, this happened here, and we were just so struck repeatedly. So Mount Auburn Cemetery, which was the first garden cemetery in America, the first one that wasn't kind of behind a church, and it set the standard for parks and public space. Leif Erikson, this is the guy who invented baking powder later went on to claim that Leif Erikson discovered America in Cambridge. It has never been, nobody else has concluded the same thing, shall we say, but he put the plaque up there. Love story, the author was a Harvard graduate and started working on it, actually was while he was at Yale, but the movie was filmed in Cambridge. George Washington Muster actually slept in Cambridge in the what's now called I think it was the Longfellow House, which was the Washington Longfellow House. And we were just like, all of these things, and poetry, Longfellow and Washington, the Army was mustered for the first time in what's now the United States. And just all of these varied things just struck us. How could one city that's never had more than 125,000 residents be the source of so many different things? And so we tried to figure out, also in our last chapter, we tried to kind of draw conclusions. What does that mean? What is, as Mike said before, the secret sauce that kind of made Cambridge distinctive? Clearly the universities played a big role, but also the fact that the city has been able to reinvent itself. It lost out on the state on being the capital of Massachusetts, but got a university instead. When the industry moved out in the 50s and 60s after World War II, Cambridge reinvented itself as a biotech, first computer and now biotech hub. So it's had this ability to reinvent itself numerous times, which we found fascinating. Pauline Hawkins was a poet, a journalist, and a writer that Waterhouse mentioned.
And Mike, so to get back to your question, so how did the pandemic affect our writing process? So it did in part because most of the libraries where I wanted to get books were closed. And so I ended up actually buying a lot of books on eBay and sort of establishing my own library of source materials. Like for $3 to $4 you can buy a book on eBay, or go to your local library if they're open. Just saying. And we didn't have a lot of other outlets for our energies during the pandemic. But
We
a
had
lot
done
of
a
the
lot of
book
work before that.
had been written before that. I think I spent a lot of its time getting the illustrations nailed down, because there are something like 200 illustrations in the book. So getting the rights to publish some of these pictures was a kind of arduous process. And really
We
by...
managed not to kill each other, even though.
Yeah, I said at the beginning, that's another whole topic, how to select co-authors as your spouse. Yeah, and I think the biggest thing was we have 2 children, and now they're adults. And I think the book sometimes is our 3rd child, and maybe that's unfair to the other 2 children, but you know, we were sort of past the point of needing to be invested daily in the lives of our children, although they still call us very crazy. So, you know, I don't know, we were bored, we were...
Passion project is the right.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious about maybe the comparisons to the Bay Area, and has the output of Cambridge been steady over time, or has Puritan influence today led to more, I don't know what the right term would be, but like more responsible innovation as opposed to maybe, you know, what...
Is anybody from California before
No,
me?
I would say one of the things we ended up focusing on were people who were innovative with a sort of sense of moral purpose. So whether that was, you know, trying to save the world from smallpox, or save the world from biological weapons, or save the world from dentist visits. I don't know, the junior mens, I'm not sure where that falls into moral purpose. But that a lot of the people, at least we focused on, you know, really were not simply driven by the desire to make money. And, you know, that's an outcome that has certainly, I mean, many of the people have become wealthy because of their inventions, but in some cases that wasn't the only goal. You know, and so I'm not sure if Silicon Valley is more sort of bottom line driven, or
Do you want to say the comment about simple problems?
yeah, we worked a little bit with another author, a guy named Bob Badera, who just recently came out with a book about Kendall Square and its history, and we sort of shared some of our notes with him, and he shared some stories with us. And one of the quotes that he comments on is that, at least in Kendall Square, that people are solving hard problems. Like they are trying to cure rare diseases, which, you know, lots of people don't affect lots of people, but affect a small number of people very intensely. Or just, you know, really, really challenging problems that aren't simply a matter of you know, writing a little code and having a good marketing plan. And so, you know, I don't know if that's just you know, Cambridge chauvinism or what. I'm sure there are lots of people in California who have altruistic motivations.
The other thing I would say is density. So Silicon Valley is much more spread out. And one of the reasons Cambridge is a biotech hub today, Novartis decided to move its researchers to Cambridge in the early 2000s, in large part because they wanted their researchers to bump into the MIT folks and the Harvard folks and the Mass General folks at the coffee shop and in the neighborhood. And so that kind of density, some people call it the most innovative mile in the world, which seems a little bit over the top, but just the idea that you really can walk and bump into people, which doesn't happen much in Silicon Valley because it's much more diffused and spread out. So I think that's something that we found was really important to Cambridge. It's in a way a small town. It has kind of that small town feel. We wrote about Zipcar. The founding of Zipcar was founded in Cambridge, which is, if you're familiar with it, it's kind of a car rental service, but by the hour, and it enables you, basically, if you don't want a second car or a first car, you can use it when you need it for a grocery trip or a doctor's appointment or whatever. And Robin Chase, who co-founded it, talks about how Cambridge was the right size to help found Zipcar, because people were urban enough that they didn't want the second car or the first car, but might need it sometimes, and also were experimental enough to be willing to try a new technology. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we come across in doing this research. Did you have a question?
distinctions between Massachusetts, Cambridge, etc., and Silicon Valley is that the bankers and venture capital funds in Massachusetts were very, very conservative. And that's the traditional heritage of Puritan heritage. Whereas in California, they were much more willing to take risks. So many startups went out to California simply because they could get the money there that they couldn't get here. For example, when Digital Equipment Corporation was started around 1950 or so, General George Dorio, who at that time was a professor at the Harvard Business School, had a venture capital fund.
First one.
And he funded Digital Equipment Corporation. He gave them $70,000 for 70% of the company.
That was a good deal.
That was what they did. In Silicon Valley, it would be $70 million for 70%. So there was a real difference in the attitude of the funders, the venture capitalists, and that was a major reason that Silicon Valley grew so much.
But he was also the first venture capitalist anywhere, and he came, I believe, and he was based in Boston, not Cambridge, so we didn't write about him. But he was innovative. He's part of what we would describe as an innovative culture in this area. I agree about conservative, but he also
very, very thrifty.
right.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And again, even in the two academic institutions, MIT has been much more aggressive about technology transfer, about licensing the results of things that happen in the labs and commercializing them, whereas Harvard has been much, much more conservative about encouraging its faculty to commercialize the results of their lab research. So again, that's certainly been
40% of the new startups in Massachusetts originated directly or indirectly with MIT or their alumni.
Yeah.
40%.
Yeah.
That's the new.
Well, and MIT itself was founded on this idea of being of practicality. I mean, they never had the ivory tower kind of mentality that Harvard sometimes is accused of.
Yeah, and I don't know the exact numbers, but Massachusetts competes with New York for being the second highest state in terms of venture capital dollars, but it's way behind California, by an order of magnitude. I mean, it's a pretty substantial sort of number 2 position, or sometimes number 3.
But I do think the fact that there was any money here is different. Say, the Research Triangle in North Carolina has been trying to kind of get to the level of Massachusetts for a long time and hasn't quite pulled it off. And there are banks in Charlotte, but there doesn't seem to be the same culture of venture capital there that there is even here.
And I think we have a relatively diverse source of funds. So we have National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, which fund a lot of the medical research. So that's government funding. Certainly during World War II, the MIT Radiation Lab was only second to the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb in terms of its level of federal funding. And so, government funding has been a huge factor in some of the successes. In addition to the basic philanthropy, I mean, obviously, both MIT and Harvard have large endowments and are the beneficiaries of lots of individual philanthropy, and so that makes a huge difference.
Anybody else?
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Great.
This is fun. Thanks for coming out. And